The Clearance Diving Branch is a highly trained specialist unit of the Royal Australian Navy. Its primary role is to locate and dispose of explosive ordnance, whether it be found underwater or on land. Formed in 1951, the branch has a 50-year history of exceptional professionalism and safety in both war and peacetime operations. This record can be largely attributed to the rigorous clearance diver training courses. Months of relentless and demanding instruction ensure that divers have the diversity of skills and high level of competence needed to perform their often hazardous duties with safety. Through training exercises, each generation passes down to the next all the knowledge they've gained from their time in the field. While they have been modified to suit the technology and operations of different eras, the basic principles of explosive ordnance disposal taught in 1955 have largely stood the test of time. This film tells the story of how these principles were developed and practiced through 4 generations of the Australian Clearance Diving Branch. It began of all places in London during the Blitz of 1940. At that time, the Royal Navy appealed to Australia to help fill their ranks. I was amongst a group of Aussies who volunteered. When we arrived in Britain, London was under continuous air attack. Night after night the bombers came in waves, dropping thousands of tons of explosives. Buckingham Palace and the House of Commons were hit, as were vast tracts of houses and factories. Thousands of civilians lost their lives, as did a high proportion of the Allied fighter pilots who took on the Luftwaffe in the skies. Britain survived the initial bombing raids, but the danger of unexploded ordnance remained. Ironically, it was the sea mine which posed the greatest threat. Sea mines laid in the North Sea were already blocking vital British shipping lanes. Because of a mine's large explosive warhead, the Germans realised the devastating potential of using these weapons against land targets. Even when they did not explode, the mines severely disrupted the British war effort. Until they were rendered safe, whole city blocks and industrial areas were out of bounds. The task of clearing unexploded mines fell to the Royal Navy. Not long after we arrived in Britain, we were asked if we would volunteer to undertake a particularly dangerous mission. Of course we volunteered, but without knowing what for. It was sobering indeed when we discovered we had joined the Render Mine Safe section, and it would be our job to defuse mines. At the time, the workings of the German mines were unknown. To minimise loss of life, only one officer was assigned to each job. Before approaching a mine, all metal objects that could activate magnetic sensors had to be removed. To complicate matters, the mines did not always land in easily accessible positions. Sometimes army engineers would be called in to dig an access shaft. Even if you did everything right, you could still be caught out. The Germans booby-trapped their mines specifically to target the person performing the render safe. The hazards were high under normal conditions and became extreme when rendering safe a new type of device.
The two fittings on the top of the mine.
When a new type of mine was approached for the first time, the knowledge gained was so important to winning the mine war that another officer would be placed at a safe distance to watch and record the procedure, just in case anything went wrong. A grim reminder to the man at the mine of the danger he was facing. Several Australians were among those who were the first to render safe a new type of weapon. Hugh Syme first rendered safe the Type T mine. Leon Goldsworthy first stripped the K-type whilst 50 feet underwater, and George Gose disposed of the first GD pressure mine. John Mole rendered safe 3 new types of mines, including the magnetic acoustic, which had previously killed others who had attempted the job. And all were rewarded with the George Cross, the highest non-combat decoration for gallantry. In 1944, when the Allies began pushing into Europe, John Mould made another major contribution. To delay the Allied advance, the Germans mined the ports of Northern Europe. Mould developed a methodology for underwater searching and clearance using divers. His systems were so well conceived and implemented that not only were the ports opened with great efficiency, but not one life was lost in the process. With supply lines assured into Europe, the work of the Royal Navy's Render Mine Safe section was largely complete. But there was no rest for the Australian mine disposal officers. In the Pacific, the war raged on. Far from the streets of London, the Australians had to adapt their EOD methods for tropical operations, including the invasions of the Philippines and Borneo. With the defeat of Japan, most soldiers returned home, but the hazardous work of mine and bomb disposal was far from over. War debris covered thousands of islands. Massive stockpiles of unexploded ordnance put the lives of millions of islanders at risk. In 1947, the RAN dispatched an EOD unit under the command of veterans Batterham and Croft to clean up the New Guinea area, a task so immense it continues to this day. A young sailor at the time, Bill Fitzgerald was a member of one of these early teams.
Yeah, at the end of World War II, the Army, Navy and Air Force were heavily involved in the disposal of explosive ordnances that had been left behind after the Japanese surrender. Our teams were in there in 1947 through to 1948, and we carried out the disposal of mines, bombs, depth charges, torpedoes and quite a few drifting Japanese type mines. We came across quite a lot of fuses belonging to the enemy.
That fuse is attached to a 500-pound bomb. The Japs left it here as a booby trap.
So we embarked in a diesel tug, going around the different islands, getting the stuff together and then detonating it from a safe distance. Normally when we went ashore doing recce's for explosive ordnances, we'd contact the chief of the local tribe, give him a couple of sticks of tobacco and ask him could he show us where there were some explosives. We'd start with 1 or 2 natives, and by the end of the day we'd have 60 or 70 natives because we were paying for each piece of information. It wasn't long before explosives was coming out of the bush, unbelievable. And we're on that vessel for a period of around about 6 weeks. Complacency started to creep in. The more you do, the more complacent you become. And every now and again you must keep pulling yourselves up, saying, "Oi, stop what you're doing." But anyway, we did a hell of a lot of jobs, big jobs like that, especially around the New Guinea area on the east coast of New Guinea.
Bill's service in the Pacific made him an ideal candidate for the fledgling Australian clearance diving branch, the formation of which was inspired by the experiences of World War II. He went on to play an influential role in the branch. In this way, ensuring that knowledge gained in World War II was passed on to the clearance divers of the future. "16 years after its formation, the clearance diving branch was back in action in Vietnam. Here, in this most complex of war zones, they had to contend with a wide range of dangerous operations, both in water and on land. As veteran John Kirschler explains.
My experience in Vietnam was part of CDT3. We were based initially in Vung Tau in the southern part of Vietnam, and then in Da Nang, which is up in the northern part, quite close to the demilitarised zone. The role of the team in Vietnam was threefold. The prime role was to search the ships that were anchored in the anchorage in Vung Tau prior to going upriver to offload. There was always a threat of sappers or enemy sappers that they would try to sink some of these ships. We had a surface EOD responsibility for the province that we were in. The other part of our operations was deployments with US Navy EOD teams. These usually involve one or two fellows going out with the Americans on operations into the bush. The one I was involved in, which was a clearance operation in the Rung Sat, which was a special zone south-east of Saigon, which was virtually a no-go area. It was a swamp. We were inserted using these craft. It took us up the river. The only people that were in there were the bad guys, so it was not a place that you would go unless you had reason to go into. The US Navy and the regional force troops would go in there from time to time and do sweeps, bunker sweeps. Not long after a firefight took place, you could hear the weapons going off, and then this went on for quite some time, half an hour or so. We were then all extracted out of the area. They brought in airstrikes all through that night and pounded this whole area. It was just rocketed and bombed all through the night, on and off. The following day we went back in, and we were involved in the clearing of those bunkers. Bunkers were usually found by the security force. They would go inside the bunker, but if they were unhappy with anything that was in there, they would quickly get out and call us, and so we would have to go in and look around, find out what they were worried about. It could be documents that were left on a table or on the ground, or it could be a box that was just sitting there, or a weapon or something, that the sorts of things that they would habitually booby trap if they were leaving the area. The blowing of the bunker was developed because if you blow the roof off a bunker with a fairly substantial charge, all you do is deepen it and make it, all they've got to do is put another roof on it, tidy it up inside, and they've got a better bunker than they had originally. We developed a technique of using a small amount of explosive in the roof to collapse the whole of the roof of the bunker into the inside. We would put a couple of CS grenades attached to the explosive and white phosphorus grenades as well, so they would detonate along with the charge. So these were sort of deterrents, if you like, to them to come back and try and open up this bunker and use it again.
Unexploded U.S. bombs are utilized by the Viet Cong in a number of ways. Demolition teams disarm the bombs and then break them down to salvage the explosive content. The fuses are converted into booby traps that are planted outside unit perimeters at night.
I think for young people, young guys coming through, you've got to understand that sometimes you might think, why do we do things this way? Why don't we do them another way? The reason you're doing them that way is because that's the way it works. And although as time passes, these procedures are modified and changed slightly, the basic things were taught to me and to others before me will be taught in the future and modified as ordnance and operational procedures change and areas of operations change, from the desert of Kuwait to the jungles of Vietnam. I mean, you can't compare the two.
In the Gulf War, the principles of EOD would once again prove timeless. With Iraqi forces in retreat, the Australian clearance divers were deployed to clear the ports and beaches of Kuwait. The operations officer was David Rose.
Whilst we were in Kuwait, we did a number of surface clearances. We also located some silkworm missiles, and there were a lot of contact sea mines washed up on the beach as well. Other situations, Iraqis had various fortifications along the beach and associated bunkers where they'd had munitions positioned to defend the beaches. A lot of the munitions, Iraqi munitions, were in pretty good condition. I mean, they were there ready to use. Some of it's still in its packaging. In those cases, it was a matter of ensuring that such positions weren't booby-trapped, but in a lot of cases, once you'd established that it wasn't booby-trapped, it was simply a matter of recovering the EO and then taking it to a disposal point.
Like an old box exploded. Geez, they must have shit themselves when that went up.
Among the most dangerous tasks were rendering safe and detonating Iraqi sea mines, as their internal workings were unknown.
This is the arming switch.
Yep.
That's the arming fork or pin, and if the mine was armed, that pin would be removed. And how we think they operate is they've got more of these covers on the horns. A wire goes round, connected to the pin, and when they're dropped in the water, the whole lot is supposed to come off. And that's supposed to spring out. Even if we were to go into this mine, we'd do everything remotely. But in this case, we're just going to slab it.
We're hooked up, ready to go.
There were times I thought, there are clearly risks involved with this, but I guess the objective was to render safe this mine, and the point being that you've done so much training over the years to be able to actually put something into practice on live enemy ordnance. I guess it's a pinnacle in your career in some respects.
The bottom line, as I'm saying, is use your experience to don't blindly follow what the books tell you. Some occasions you will find that the books are applicable in certain situations, but when a situation comes along where they're not, you've then got to think laterally and try and figure out what you're going to do based on the situation that you're in. I think, just have confidence in what you're taught, because it is based on a lot of experience, based on different conflicts, different parts of the world and different situations, and it does work.
And as I got older and I look back, I realised that clearance diving is an art, that within the clearance diving branch They're the greatest people that I've ever met in my life.
From its beginnings in World War II, the clearance diving branch has grown from strength to strength, with the contribution of each generation's knowledge and experience. Now is the time for the divers of today to build on this fine tradition of safe and successful operations.